예, 안녕하세요. 그럼 지금으로부터 제3회
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to open the third Global Forum on Climate Change Law and Institutions under the theme of Biden administration's carbon neutral policy and Korea-U.S. climate change cooperation. This seminar is co-hosted by the Korea Legislation Research Institute and the CSDL Lab and the Global Korea Society of Climate Change Research, Global American Business Institute, and Energy Business Newspaper supported our forum. First, I'd like to invite Kim Jae-hong, President of Korea Legislation Research Institute, for his opening remarks. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, nice to meet you. My name is Kim Jae-hong, President of KLRI. I'm very delighted to see many participants from home and abroad, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this forum. Our institute is in cooperation with the Korea Society of Climate Change and the KSD Lab, and has planned the 4 rounds of Global Forum this year. And the first forum was held in June 30th, and July 21st, we held the second forum. It was the second forum, and as the third forum, we will talk about Biden administration's carbon neutral policy and Korea-U.S. climate change cooperation. Last year's presidential election in the U.S. was a very good turning point for the climate change perspective. And the climate change response effort of the Biden administration was very high, and it bore results. Early August, the Senate in the U.S. passed a bill regarding the investment in transit and other infrastructures, including rail, and it will cover the $1 trillion investment. And the Biden administration also lead and show its willingness to lead the global efforts to respond to climate change. The COP26 will be held in November in the UK, and the US is grabbing the attention from the world for its policy. Korea also passed the law regarding the climate change response in August 31st, and it will be declared and promulgated. And according to the Paris Agreement, and to implement our commitment, we are pushing ahead with our efforts to meet the target. Climate change is not just a political rhetoric or declaration. We should respond to this issue as a policy task. In addition, to achieve the carbon neutrality and response to the climate change, the issue is not limited to one country, and the global efforts is needed. This forum will cover the U.S. policy, and you will talk and listen to the latest policy direction of the Biden administrations. In that regard, I think it is very meaningful forum. Very important issues will be covered and presented by many experts, including the lead Schuler, senior advisor to John Kerry, Stavins, professor of Harvard Kennedy School, and Sheila Hollis. And I'd like to thank all the participants and experts who will share their insights and opinion on this issue. I expect continued collaboration in this regard at the international level. also thank the Hanyang, the former ambassador of the Republic of Korea to U.S., Andrew Harp, Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs, and other person who will give speech in this forum. I hope that this forum will be a fruitful and useful and productive session. And thank you very much for your participation.
네, 감사합니다.
Very much.
몇 분을 초청해서
To invite some speakers for their congratulatory remarks, and some of them will give the offline speech, and some of them will deliver the welcoming remarks online. First, I'd like to invite Hanyang, former ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the U.S. and the senior advisor to KST Lab, for his welcoming remarks.
Good morning. 이건 저 한국에서 참가하시는 분들을 위한 인사고요. Good evening. That's for participants in the United States. Yes, there are participants from Korea as well as from the United States. And in the United States, of course, this is evening, and evening of Sunday. And I said to myself, wow, what a smart way of wrapping up your weekend on Sunday evening. But anyhow, because of this, that is to say, there are participants from Seoul and participants from the United States. Language, what language shall I speak? That's the first thing I should be settling. And then what I'm thinking about doing is, I'm going to make 3 points. First point, I will make the first sentence, I will say the first sentence in English and elaborate it in the Korean language. And I'll do the same thing for the second point as well as the third point. So let me start. My first point is the most important point, which is thank you. And then for that, 지금 그 한국법제연구원 원장님께서 이미
Already, the president of KLRI already expressed his gratitude for the participation of you. I really appreciate your participation. Very important institutions and experts regarding the climate change are participating in this forum. Already, the previous speaker expressed his gratitude, but
그다음에 한국 기후 변화학회 회장
the Minister of Counselor for Economic Affairs, President of Korean Society of Climate Change, and the President of Global American Business Institute will deliver their congratulatory remarks. And GGGI was founded, and at the time I was the Vice Secretary of the Ministry of Affairs, and I was the chair of the GGGI, sorry. And there is a participant from GGGI. And there is also a participant from the Korea Energy Economics Institute. When I was working for the government, I was in close cooperation with the Korea Energy Economics Institute. And there is a participant from Energy Business Newspaper. And Professor Kim from Hanyang University are participating here with us.
who is president of Kerry, and Mr. Reed Schuler, who in fact is the senior advisor to Special Envoy, Presidential Envoy John Kerry. And then we have Robert Stavins, who is a professor at the Harvard University. And then we have Sheila Hollis, who is acting Secretary General of U.S. Energy Agency. So thank you so much. So that's my first point. My second point, that is the importance of U.S. leadership. And when I say importance of leadership, that is what I think is, well, we in fact all understand about the importance of Paris Climate Accord. In my mind, it would not have been possible without the leadership of the United States. More importantly, it will not be possible to have it implemented sufficiently without leadership of the United States. That's my second point. 제가 파리 기후 변화 협정이 맺어지던 2015년 12월.
In Washington, I was working as ambassador to the U.S. At that time, there was Obama president and Vice President Biden, and there was also John Kerry, Secretary of State at the time, and they were working very hard to make the Paris Agreement possible. And I looked at their effort in person, and what Obama thought that to achieve and make the Paris Accord successful, critical steps are necessary. That was what he was thinking. He said that emissions from airplanes need to be reduced. That was the agenda. At that time, I was very impressed by his idea. In December 2015, I was impressed by his idea because it was not first thought not by the United States. EU proposed the idea in 2011. At that time, COP was held in South Africa, and EU proposed that idea. That was reducing the emission from the airplanes. I was the Korean ambassador to EU, and I felt it was very helpful and good idea because emissions from airplanes is very serious issue. The EU's proposal was equal footing that is imposed on all airlines. It means that it was the fair proposal, I think, because not all of the airlines will not be adversely affected by the proposal. So I supported the idea, but their efforts failed. Unfortunately, the U.S. did not support the idea. I don't know the exact reason why the U.S. did not support the idea. But after 4 years, in 2015, when I worked as an ambassador to the United States, President Obama proposed the idea, and then agreement was made. By looking at the process, I felt that the leadership of the United States has a very powerful impact on the global decision. That's what I experienced. That was before the Paris Climate Accord, and we need to think about how to implement the accord. I mention and emphasize the importance of the Paris Climate Accord. It is not a binding accord. It is kind of loose regulation. So leadership is necessary and essential to implement this Paris Climate Accord. And I think financial leadership can be exerted by the U.S. Without money and without investment and without technological leadership by the United States, it is hard to implement the Climate Accord. And modal leadership is also important. I think the U.S. is the only country who can assert the modal leadership. So given the characteristics of the Climate Accord, financial, moral, and technological leadership can be exerted only by the United States. So the second point is the importance of the U.S. leadership. 세 번째는 가장
United States. 한국과 미국
in the Korea-U.S. relations, the most important thing is the alliance. The alliance was formed in 1953 as soon as the Korean War ended. And in 2013, when I was working at the Korean ambassador to the US, 60th anniversary was held. And 2 years later, we will have a 70th anniversary of the Korea-US ally. After 60 or 70 years of alliance, the power of the alliance could be weakened. But the Korea-US alliance in 2013 and nowadays have been stronger and is getting stronger and powerful. I think the reason is that the US and Korea are very cooperating and using the Korea-US alliance for emerging issues. And at this point, there are many important issues to be solved by the both countries. As soon as the President Biden was elected, he made an acceptance speech on November 7th. It was a very short speech. With the short speech, he made a very powerful impact. Short and powerful acceptance speech. He pointed out 4 things. That was, administration will try our best to solve this problem, and the problems include the pandemic, economy, racial issues, and climate change. The first 3 are domestic issues in the US, and climate change is the only international issue, he pointed out. And when I heard his powerful and short but powerful speech, I thought that President Biden takes the climate change issue very seriously. And I was very encouraged by his speech. As I pointed out in my second point, without the leadership of the US, we cannot make it successful. But President Biden pointed climate change as one of the 4 major issues to be solved by him, and I was very encouraged by his commitment. But in Korea, as president of Korea Legislation Research Institute already pointed out, the basic law of carbon neutrality passed in Korea. Carbon neutrality is the task to be achieved by all countries in the world, and many countries are committed to achieving the carbon neutrality. But there are only 14 countries who incorporated the commitment to the carbon neutrality into legislation. So Korea-US alliance, which will mark the 70th anniversary. For the alliance, climate change has emerged as a very important issue. But the key here is that I have been working as a Korean ambassador for a long time. For international cooperation, the key is to meet each other in person. And Korea Legislation Research Institute and KSD Lab are working very hard to deal with climate change, and they are holding today's global forum under the theme of Biden administration's carbon neutral policy and Korea-US climate change cooperation. And I'd like to very thankful for their efforts to organize this kind of important forum where key opinion leaders can express their opinion in this topic. I hope that both parties will gather their wisdom. And thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much for your welcoming remarks, Mr. Ahn. And we are going to invite the 3 speakers for congratulatory remarks. First will be delivered by Andrew Harab, the Minister Counsel for Economic Affairs from the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. Good morning, everyone.
On behalf of the U.S. Embassy, congratulations to the Korean Legislation Research Institute for organizing such a timely seminar. As Ambassador Ahn noted, addressing climate change is a top priority for the Biden administration, as I know it is for President Moon and the Korean people. The United States remains committed to collaborating with the Republic of Korea to fight the urgent climate crisis facing our nations and the world. I'd like to recognize and congratulate Ambassador An Ho-young and Korea Legislation Research Institute President Kim Ge-hong for bringing us together to discuss this important issue. Thank you as well to the Korea Society of Climate Change Research President No Dong-woon, an expert on climate change in developing countries, and Global America Business Institute President Florence Lo Lee, a leading voice on the Korea energy transition. I appreciate the opportunity to share the stage with leaders dedicated to responding to the threat of climate change. I'd also like to highlight the important presentations later this morning from US experts. Professor Robert Stavins is a world-renowned expert on the intersection of economics and environmental policy. Sheila Hollis, the acting executive director of the United States Energy Association, has decades of experience crafting energy policy and will provide a private sector perspective. Finally, Reed Schuler, senior advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry, will provide video remarks outlining the Biden administration's aggressive response to climate threat, including collaboration with allies such as the Republic of Korea. And of course, thank you to Professor Chung and his team for organizing this forum. Before our experts take the stage, I would like to outline briefly US efforts to work with the ROK to address global climate change. During their May summit in Washington, President Biden and President Moon strengthened our commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. In their joint statement, they agreed to set examples among world leaders in reducing carbon emissions, conserving and enhancing natural carbon sinks, and expanding collaboration on technology and innovation to meet our climate goals. Our leaders also committed to work together at the OECD and other international venues to end public financing for coal-fired power plants. We will align our international financing to achieve global net zero emissions while facilitating clean and zero emissions vehicle development for our respective government fleets. I am pleased to note that since the May summit, US and ROK experts have joined in technical exchanges to enhance our efforts to achieve our 2030 targets and our 2050 goals. We are also engaged in close consultations on the importance of the ROK announcing a 2030 target that is in line with President Moon's commitment to net zero by 2050. The global coalition of advanced and developing economies taking action is growing and generating momentum as we approach COP26 in Glasgow. As an emerging global economic power, technology leader, and major emitter, Korea is an important part of this coalition, and we are working closely with the government to encourage enhanced ambition. Here in Seoul, our embassy is complementing our government-to-government collaboration through the launch of our own climate network called Uri Earth to build support for climate action. I encourage all of you to visit our website or social media for more information. Thank you again to our outstanding hosts for preparing such an important and well-conceived seminar. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Next, we are going to invite Mo Dong-woon, President of Korean Society of Climate Change Research, and will be joining us on the online platform. So please start your congratulatory remarks, Mr. Mo. Distinguished guests, Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs, Andrew Harab, Professor Suh-Yong, three presenters, as well as the panelists. Thank you very much and nice to see you. Now, it's one of the turning point to achieve the Paris Agreement, as the Paris Agreement was signed in the 2015, and then now in 3 years, and it was preparation time, and in 5 years, we also set the target. In this regard, The signing on the Paris Agreement was one of the very turning point, along with the serious issues to talk and deal with around the world. And now we are also ahead towards the direction to make the 1.5 degrees Celsius be as of the BAU. And among the G20 countries and the 32, the countries were participating, we also declared their carbon, the net zero emissions. In this regard, along with the inaugurations of the Biden administration, proactive efforts in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions are also undergoing. And in terms of the 2030 targets, the two countries, the US and Korea, have also revised upward in order to reduce the GHG. As of the BAU, the 24.4% have been also highlighted. And as of the 2050, the targets have been also strengthened as well. And the US has also revised to reduce the 17% from the 2005 level. So 50 to 52% have been also the highly strengthened. But in this regard, the countries all around have also submitted the indices, but still we are having a lot of the long journey to really achieve the targets. In order to achieve the carbon neutrality, the no net zero or no emissions, as well as electrifications and energy efficiencies, and reductions in the using the energy, the consumptions are to be strongly addressed. By 2050, in order to reduce the target for the GHG, the 45% can be only achievable by the technology, the sectors in the future. This requires a lot of new technologies, including the hydrogen as well as the renewable energy sources. But the 60% of the sources will be also impacted as well among the target. In this regard, the citizens are to participate in use of the climate change issues and the targets. And we have also seen a lot of the significant impact and influence from the US government. This requires a lot of the collaborations and cooperations around the world as well. Throughout the forum today, we'll be also listening to the presentations as well as the panel discussions, strategies to achieve the targets, climate change, international cooperations around the world to be also addressed and discussed. And I will hope that we can really have available time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your congratulatory speech. Next, I'd like to invite the Global America Business Institute for her welcoming and congratulatory remarks.
My name is Dukwoo, and I'm the president and the founder of the Global America Business Institute in Washington, D.C. Briefly about GABI. Since its inception in 2011, one of the GABI's primary missions has been to act as a platform for discussion on policy-relevant energy and technology issues, with a focus on technologies that facilitate low-carbon energy future, including nuclear power. GABI regularly organizes seminars, workshops, and publish podcast interviews, as well as produce reports and research papers on topics related to carbon neutrality and clean energy. For more information, please visit www.thegabi.com. As we all know probably, President Joe Biden is widely recognized as a climate president. On the first day in the office, he signed an executive order to rejoin the Paris Agreement and promised to take an aggressive action to undertake climate change. He also signed the order to tackle the climate crisis at home and abroad, laying out requirements for federal agencies to prioritize climate in implementing both foreign and domestic policies. Additionally, he proposed extraordinary climate investment in his region infrastructure plan. But solving climate change takes global effort. We all have experienced extreme weather conditions and it is becoming more common and more intense. Many of you probably saw the footage of Hurricane Ida that brought devastating winds and heavy rainfall in the U.S. just 2 weeks ago, flooding streets and homes and paralyzed New York City subway system. At the same time, deadly wildfires on the West Coast continue to burn out of control, destroying the forestry and the infrastructure and threatening the air quality of the residents. The impact of climate change also brought hotter than usual temperature in Korea this summer. Climate crisis global pandemic that requires global attention. During the summit between President Biden and President Moon, the two leaders committed to jointly tackle various global issues, including climate change. And today's workshop is very timely. Looking at the list of speakers and the panelists, I can see that it is going to be stimulating and productive discussion. And I'm grateful that Global America Business Institute is able to take a part in hosting this very exciting global climate forum. I am very much looking forward to learn from these experts and share views and ideas about collaborating between two allies on combating climate crisis. Thanks for joining us today, and please enjoy today's program. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you. 그러면 이제 곧
Next, we are going to end the opening session, and then we are going to start the presentation in a few minutes. For the participants in the venue, most of the participants are the Koreans. And we also be having the online sessions as well. All the presenters are from the US. And for the first presentation, I'm also going to provide in the English.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having the various encouraging statements by eminent leaders, both in the United States and Korea, in the opening session. My name is Suh-Yong Chung Suh-Yong, professor at the Korea University at the Division of International Studies. At the same time, I'm wearing several hats actually, belonging to several co-host organizations. I'm also director of the CS Lab, Center for Climate and Sustainable Development, Law and Policy. I'm also a vice president of Korea Climate Research Society. We have 3 presentations this morning and evening from the government, and then academia and the private sector. We try to have them all online at the same time, but due to the big time difference between the Seoul and then United States, some of them will participate in a recording way. So having said that, I'd like to invite first speaker, Mr. Reed Schuler. He is the senior advisor to John Kerry. So Mr. Schuler, you have the floor.
Hi, I'm Reed Schuler, and I'm a senior advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. The U.S. and the Republic of Korea have been deepening their collaboration to combat the climate crisis. And we were delighted that President Moon came to the April Leader Summit on Climate that President Biden hosted. The first head of state summit hosted by this administration to focus purely on accelerating the global fight against the climate crisis. The Biden-Harris administration has made the climate crisis a centerpiece of their policy agenda, both domestically and internationally. And that's why the United States is working hand in glove with partners like the Republic of Korea and others to accelerate our fight around the world. At home, this administration is deeply committed to working across sectors to make ambitious reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. At the April Leaders Summit on Climate, the President announced a new and ambitious target of reducing emissions by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels in 2030, slashing emissions in half. That fight will require a comprehensive transformation of our economy, sector by sector. And fighting the climate crisis in the United States is a whole of government effort because to be successful, that's what it requires. The infrastructure bill is one important step forward, and the bill, as passed by the Senate, does a number of important things. It makes the largest ever federal investment in public transit. It makes the largest investment in rail infrastructure since the creation of Amtrak. It invests in electric vehicle charging infrastructure across the country, helping to put in place the system that we need if we are to enable the president's ambitious electric vehicle goals. And it electrifies thousands of school and transit buses. It makes the largest ever investments in clean water and wastewater infrastructure, helping to deliver clean drinking water for millions of Americans, and makes a number of other important investments in community resilience to protect Americans from the worst impacts of climate change. But the work will go on through agency rulemaking, in transportation, in industry, in other areas, and the work will go on the Hill to continue to work with our congressional partners to ensure that we work to put in place climate policies that truly deliver for Americans at home and our partners abroad. And we are pleased that the Republic of Korea is committed to doing the same, to putting forward a strong target to reduce emissions in 2030 in a way that is compatible with President Moon's net zero goal and compatible with accelerating the global fight against climate change to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So thank you for having me to this event. Thank you for holding this event. And thank you for all the work that folks are doing to consider how the Republic of Korea can continue to develop its own plan to dramatically reduce emissions, to phase down coal consumption at home, to accelerate the electrification of transportation, and put in place so many other changes that will deliver not only success in the fight against climate change, but economic benefits, health benefits, and protection for our communities from the dangerous effects of climate change. Thank you again, and we look forward to further collaboration.
Thank you, Mr. Schuler. We've been listening to various perspectives this morning already from the United States and Korea. And one of the key points that it is necessary for us to have a U.S. leadership in the tackle against the climate change. And then Ambassador An, quoted his own personal experiences, comparing how it is important and influential and necessary for the U.S. to support global efforts to address climate change. That is true, and then that's what we now understand. At the same time, I think it is also necessary for us to think and remember that Korea can be a very important partner for the United States, not only for the government, also for the private sectors, also discussions at NGOs and academic levels. It is also necessary and important. Actually, if we take a look at the previous statements between the two summits of the Republic of Korea and the United States in various occasions, it's very actually surprising to know that there are already a lot of commitments made at the summit level about the importance of the cooperation between the United States and Korea. However, at the practical level, I've been observing that there was not sufficient implementation of those high-level commitments made at the summit level. So now I think that it's time for us to think how we can actually bring those already existing commitments at the summit level in terms of cooperation between the United States and Korea on climate change to the ground level. In the sense that I think the first speaker emphasized that aspect to some extent. Having said that, I would like to invite second speaker, Professor Robert Stavins, Meyer Professor of Harvard Kennedy School. He is, as we all know, that one of the leading scholars in the world in the climate area. So Professor Stavins, floor is yours.
Well, it's very good to be with all of you today. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person in Seoul, a wonderful city that I visited many times. But I'm pleased to at least be able to be with you remotely. And for that purpose, I am going to now share my screen so that I can use some slides that I've produced for this. And as you can see, my topic is what will happen with U.S. climate change policy under the Biden administration. And I'm going to start by saying that there's a challenge, and that is that, of course, President Biden initiated the process on Inauguration Day of rejoining the Paris Agreement, and the U.S. became a party once again 30 days later on February 19th. But that was the easy part. The hard part was producing a new nationally determined contribution, or NDC, a statement of how and how much U.S. greenhouse gases will be reduced by the year 2030. I say that that was challenging for two reasons, two necessary conditions. The first was that that NDC needed to be ambitious enough to satisfy both domestic green advocacy groups and some members of the Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, and also some key countries, in particular the European Union and its member states. At a minimum, that meant it had to be more ambitious than the Obama-era NDC, which was a 26 to 28% reduction below 2005 levels by the year 2025. So let's take a look then at what the ambition is of the U.S. NDC and also of some other countries. But in saying this, we should keep in mind that one of the reasons for the success of the Paris Agreement was the tremendous cooperation that had existed at the time between the United States and China at all levels, up to the heads of state of the two countries. Unfortunately, what we've seen during the Trump years, and to some degree carried on, I'm sorry to say, under the Biden years, is a spirit not of cooperation, but of confrontation on trade issues, intellectual property, human rights, and international security. So that changes tremendously the situation that we had previously. So here's a look at the NDCs of the top emitters. I'm only looking at the quantitative emissions targets. And what I'll focus on are those in yellow. Those are the new NDCs, not the first set, but the second set for the year 2030. And you can see the US is a 50 to 52% reduction by 2030 below the 2005 level. The European Union is more aggressive even than that. Japan's is less aggressive, and it uses a different baseline. There's the Canadian one, which is similar to the US, not surprisingly. And then the United Kingdom's is more ambitious than any, partly due to the fact that they're, of course, the hosts of the upcoming Conference of the Parties in Glasgow in November. Now, in comparing those NDCs, we have to take account of the fact that there are different baseline years. Some use 1990 and some use 2005. You won't be surprised to hear that countries use whichever baseline makes them look good. So we find that Britain and the European Union use a 1990 baseline. There's reductions would not look as ambitious if they use the 2005 baseline. But even more striking is the United States, which with the 2005 baseline looks better than it would with a 1990 baseline. And so too with Canada and Australia. Japan, again, uses an entirely different baseline year. So looking at that then, what's necessary to take account of is that for the United States and the European Union, emissions have been decreasing, and the NDCs, which I've labeled here as pledge, would have them continue to decrease. But what's striking for India, China, and many developing countries is that the NDC commitments or statements are relative statements, changes in carbon intensity or comparisons with business as usual. So these, which are carbon intensity, that is emissions per unit of economic growth, what it means in terms of emissions depends upon what the rates of economic growth are going forward. And so you can see, for example, for China, it could mean emissions reductions, but with high levels of economic growth, it would actually mean at best stabilizing emissions. So then in terms of that first necessary condition for the NDC to be successful, remember, was to be ambitious enough to satisfy key countries and domestic politics. And that condition has been satisfied by this 50 to 52% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. But the other necessary condition is that it must be credible. And by credible, what I mean is achievable with reasonably anticipated policy actions, not just hoped for policy actions or announced policy actions, but ones that can reasonably be anticipated to be enacted and implemented. And the only way that both of those conditions can be met, in my view, is with aggressive new legislation. But there is a problem that the upper house in the United States, the Senate, requires essentially 60 votes. Democrats control at best 51 votes, unless a device called budget reconciliation is used, in which case a simple majority is needed. But that's for only limited types of legislation that involve expenditures or revenue that affect the budget. And one still needs 51 votes, which is non-trivial for Democrats because of particular members, Democratic members of the Senate. So for that reason, I would say that prospects for major comprehensive climate legislation, something along the lines of the Waxman-Markey bill during the Obama years, which failed in the Senate, are really not very good. However, non-climate legislation may be feasible that can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A post-COVID economic stimulus bill can have a green tinge, if not a free, truly green hue, as does the European Union Green Deal. And importantly, an infrastructure bill with funds for electricity upgrades, for greater reliance on renewable sources, and to facilitate greater penetration of electric vehicles, funding for EV charging stations for public transit. All of this is in the March 31st proposal from the White House. However, a problem is that the more that infrastructure bill moves in the direction of climate and the more it has new tax elements, then the bipartisan support disappears from it. Now, there are some less ambitious but truly bipartisan types of climate legislation, which could be feasible. But the stringency and scope would be less than certainly President Biden's climate plan from back in the campaign would have provided. In particular, tax incentives or subsidies. After all, politicians, at least politicians in my country, in the United States, don't like to give out costs, but they love to give out benefits. So subsidies, tax incentives for wind and solar power, carbon capture and storage, nuclear power, technology initiatives, electric vehicle rebates. Many of these could be bipartisan, as some of them, in fact, have been bipartisan in the past. But this kind of bipartisan legislation is unlikely to satisfy the demands of those domestic Greens or the international calls for actions, or more to the point, to achieve the Biden NDC. Indeed, if you read the actual NDC from the US government itself, you'll notice that it makes no mention whatsoever of potential legislation. So the Biden administration, like the Obama administration earlier in this realm, may have to opt for regulatory approaches. And by regulatory approaches, I should say, what I'm referring to are approaches that can be taken essentially unilaterally by the executive branch that do not require legislation from the Congress. The important thing, though, as I'll get to, is there is a third branch of the US government, the judiciary, and that does have effects on regulatory approaches. So what would these regulatory approaches be? Well, executive orders to reverse the Trump regulatory rollbacks, major candidates, some of which have already been undertaken now. I'll mention three important examples. One would be to reinstate and, if possible, surpass the Obama CAFE standards. These are the motor vehicle fuel efficiency standards. It looks like they won't be as stringent as the Obama era ones, but they'll certainly be more ambitious than the Trump era ones were. Very important would be to reinstate the Obama era rule regarding methane leaking from wells and pipelines. Methane, as you may know, is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas in terms of its radiative forcing per unit. It does not remain in the atmosphere as long as CO2, but while it's in the atmosphere, it is exceptionally important. Third, something the administration is doing is to recalculate the social cost of carbon. It was approximately $50 per ton calculation from the Obama administration. With the Trump administration, when they used an inappropriately high discount rate and limited damage calculations to the United States, not global, it went down to $1 a ton. An interim measure was put in place after inauguration of $51 a ton. And there is now in the administration a interagency working group to come up with a new estimate, which I believe is probably going to be on the order of $100 per ton because of lowering the discount rate from 3% to 2%. That's very important because that social cost of carbon feeds into regulatory impact analysis for all types of regulatory initiatives. What's missing from this, you'll notice, is a policy that would reduce emissions in the electricity sector, which is actually the low-hanging fruit in the United States. It can be done at relatively low cost. What is being considered is a clean electricity standard, but whether or not that will be able to be designed in ways, which is the plan, so that it can go through budget reconciliation, can pass, therefore, with a simple majority, we're going to have to wait and see. There are also regulatory actions by some of the agencies. One example is that the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates stocks and derivatives, that may put in place disclosure requirements for climate risk, along with all sorts of other disclosure requirements. But as I suggested, there's a challenge also with regulatory approaches, and that is that new rules under existing statutory authority require a lengthy notice and comment period, an extensive record, interagency consultation, and they are subject to litigation. And for those of you who are not from the United States, if you don't know it, I will just mention the US is an extremely litigious society, and the role of litigation is very important in the policy realm. New regulations now are, in my judgment, much more likely to be challenged successfully than were regulations promulgated during the Obama years. And that's because there are 245 Trump-appointed federal judges. That's more than 25% of the total number of federal judges. But even more important than that is the actual highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, which now has a 6-3 conservative majority. And not any kind of conservative majority, but one that favors literal reading of statutes, giving much less flexibility to departments and agencies. Indeed, it is conceivable that this court may modify or overrule even what is called the Chevron doctrine, under which for decades now, federal courts defer to regulatory agencies when Congress was not actually perfectly clear about what it wanted, which it virtually never is. So with that, let me close with some sources of optimism for U.S. policy action, because I fear much of that may have sounded pessimistic. First of all, this is the United States of America, and subnational policy, in this case at the state level, is extremely important. Subnational policies, principally California, Oregon, and Washington, and also in the Northeast and Middle Atlantic states, have become more and more important as we've seen a lack of action from Washington, D.C. Indeed, a bottom-up implicit national policy may continue to evolve from the Democratic-leaning states. Pardon me. And these Democratic-leaning states, the so-called blue states, if you look back to one of the recent elections, they represent actually more than half of U.S. population, but it's even more impressive if we look at economic activity, because they represent an even greater share of economic activity and greenhouse gas emissions. But actually, my greatest source of optimism regarding climate policy action under the new Biden administration is that this administration, in truly dramatic contrast with the previous Trump administration, seems to embrace scientific and other expertise, such as for the best scientists, lawyers, and even economists to design climate policies that can also be politically feasible. And that is essentially what is needed. So I have two remaining words, which are thank you. And then also I would like to mention that if you'd like to read more about anything that I've spoken of or what I have not talked about, the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, which I direct, the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, which I also direct, my own website, my blog, or of course, you can follow me on Twitter. So again, I will simply say thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stavins. As always, that his presentation opened up a new understanding on what's going on in climate world, this time at the U.S. level. We all know that the Paris Agreement encouraged every member country to develop their own climate policy at the national level so that we can meet the global ambition of maintaining minimum 2-degree target and hopefully 1.5-degree target. And we now know that due to the unique characteristics of the U.S. legislation process, making process, then there are different policy options that the U.S. administration might be able to seek for, and that still there are some issues. However, he emphasized that eventually Biden administration focuses on embracing scientists and the best technologists, and then lawyers and other experts into the process of the implementation of the policy. And then he is optimistic to think that because of these issues that the Biden administration climate policy would be eventually moving forward a lot more than before. And then there are some similarities and differences between the U.S. and Korea in terms of the legislation process. And then it's always important for us to see what are the similarities at the same time differences in this context, and how we can get some lessons from the U.S. experiences. And also, in the future, Korea also needs to interact with the U.S. necessary counterparts to share what are the necessary issues during the process of legislation in Korea as well. Having said that, now I'd like to have a third speaker. Third speaker has a lot of experiences in the climate area from the private sector perspective. And then Ms. Sheila Hollis, Acting Executive Director of the United States Energy Association. Sheila, I'm sorry that I cannot meet you in person here in Seoul, but we look forward to listening to your presentation today. So floor is yours.
It is a privilege and a pleasure to be with you today. I'm delighted to join you. And I taught energy law for over 20 years at George Washington University Law School and have been involved in energy since the day I came to Washington, including as Director of Enforcement at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and establishing that office. I'm delighted to report about what my perspective is, which is very analogous to Professor Stavins' slightly different perspective. Just a little bit about what the United States Energy Association is and does. First of all, we're nonpartisan, we're non-political, and we work very, very extensively, not just domestically, but internationally. We have worked in a total of over 104 countries across 6 continents, all in coordination with the U.S. government. Let me say that we have moved among a variety and through a variety of different administrations to make this happen. Because we are non-political, non-profit, non-lobbying, we work very closely with the federal government, Agency for International Development, the Department of Energy, and the U.S. Department of State. And I am delighted to be with you tonight. I've been an energy lawyer for a long time, and Professor Stavins, I've had the pleasure of speaking with in the past. Just a little bit here about what all we are perceiving, analogous to what Professor Stavins and the other experts have commented on, including representative from our embassy. We see, of course, global generation and demand going up very, very dramatically. We have to be ready to meet that thirst for energy and preferably clean energy. And we will be in a global competition with a variety of players. We know that energy never sleeps. Directly or indirectly, everything on Earth is dependent on energy. All life is dependent on the availability of energy and the safety of energy. We're seeing a greatly heightened focus on cybersecurity and physical security of our systems. I want to emphasize that and the physical security and cybersecurity has been tested repeatedly over a number of decades, and we're seeing the sophistication in that arena advance. What we are looking to help develop is reliable, affordable, and environmentally conscious energy, focusing on development, delivery, distribution, utilization for the health and well-being of the public, not just domestically, but internationally, working with USAID, State Department, and Department of Energy. We are also seeking to support the building of fair and transparent energy structures, legally and through policy initiatives. And we have a sincere, intense dedication to addressing the problems of the past, the cleanup issues of the past, and looking towards the future. Next slide, please. U.S. and Korea are members of the International Partnership for the Hydrogen Economy, which we have had a long relationship with Korea on, and we have traveled in the past to Seoul to assist the DOE during that summit. I am acting executive director as a result of the sudden death of our executive director for over 30 years. And he led our US delegation to the World Energy Conference in Korea a number of years ago. And we are sponsoring and have sponsored, whenever we have the opportunity, a briefing by the Korean Institute of Energy Technology Evaluation and Planning on the current status of carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration in art and technology in Korea. And we have been involved in a number of major R&D projects and international cooperation activities. Next slide, please. Just a perspective on the world otherwise, overall, the massive amount of energy consumption that is going up with respect to both increased population, also increased industrialization, increased desire for the benefits of electric and other sources of energy. We're seeing it zoom up, frankly, particularly in China, but the US is certainly not going down dramatically. Europe is slightly but India, Africa, and Korea are all going up. And we are trying to work with the realities of the situation worldwide and to put on programs to inform not just the United States, but throughout the world on what the situation is. Next slide, please. This is global energy consumption. Renewables is going up. It's been going up. Even in the Trump administration, it's been going up. Now it's going significantly up. We perceive the renewables as a huge opportunity. We see coal diminishing slightly, but not entirely. We're talking here, not just in the US, we're talking IEA numbers worldwide. We see utilization of natural gas worldwide remaining approximately where it is today, maybe going up a little bit. Nuclear plants in a number of countries are going offline. In the US, we have retired a number of nuclear plants that are over 40 years old. Some of them have had extensions to 60, but that's highly unlikely. We see our nuclear fleet aging, and a number of these plants have gone offline. This is worldwide, but we see certainly in the US that nuclear is an area that can be advanced. We see small SMR, small modular reactors developing more and more, and we know that the Department of Energy and others are working on the development of those types of SMRs and other opportunities there. We see consumption of liquid fuels going down over time, and that's the direction that the world is headed, not just in the US, but across the board, albeit with the escalation of population in some countries it's not going down dramatically, it's going slightly down, but we expect that there will continue to be liquid fuels utilized in much of the world, and the demand not diminishing at all, but pretty much staying the same through at least 2050. Next slide, please. Just from, you're aware of this, but just the primary energy consumption as of a year or so ago, petroleum, 43%, coal 28%. Much of this is being imported into Korea. Natural gas, significant but not a huge amount of consumption. Nuclear, not insignificant, and renewables. We see this definitely changing rapidly with development internationally, moving towards more renewables, perhaps developing more nuclear. Natural gas utilization worldwide staying relatively high, but not through the roof. Although certainly with respect to the Russian pipeline, Nord Stream is going to impact that percentage number worldwide. Next slide, please. Your primary energy consumption we've gone through, but the fuel type, coal, petroleum liquids, natural gas, this is 2019, but that is going to change somewhat dramatically over the next few years. Renewables are going to grow. Natural gas imports into Korea are going to grow, certainly. South Korea's primary energy consumption fuel type, you see coal, gas, nuclear, petroleum, and other liquids are in that spot as of the moment. These are BP numbers, by the way. We see the reliance on fossil fuels in Korea continuing. There'll be this steady increase in gas, coal, and nuclear consumption. We don't see international oil or natural gas pipelines. It may ultimately happen, but it's not now. But relying exclusively now on tanker shipments of LNG and crude oil, at least in the interim. Korea ranks among the world's top 5 importers of LNG, coal, and petroleum liquids. That's just a need that exists. And there will be those who will be able to help fill that need, including Australia, Qatar, Malaysia, Oman, Indonesia, Russia, and others. So that is going to be the case for a few more years until this evolution towards more renewables and potential other arenas, continued LNG is going to continue on apace. It's impossible to slam on the brakes quickly, but the evolution will certainly speed up. Nuclear energy overview, we've seen that. Renewable energy overview, we see renewable energy heading up, accounting for 6% of total generation in Korea in 2019. It's expected to grow long-term based on your incentives and the power plan targets and your plan to raise renewable energy to 20% of the generation and maybe as much as 30% or more by 2040. Policies have been announced to limit coal-fired and nuclear generation, but it's hard to replace that massive amount of power with renewables, but it is certainly can be nibbled away at over time, and we see that as the future for you. Next slide, please. Renewables, we see that going up, particular solar PV, wind, and some modest tidal power and wave and ocean power. Just a bit about the infrastructure bill, key energy provisions. We heard from Professor Stavins. I've had the pleasure of sharing programs with him in the past. I think a critical part of what we see in the future with respect to infrastructure in the US and in Korea is cybersecurity, the need for cybersecurity. Next slide, please, with respect to that. And certainly in our infrastructure bill that was discussed by Professor Stavins, cybersecurity is a key part of it. Enhanced grid cybersecurity through public-private partnerships are going to be critical. Electric vehicles, critical. We are going to see them evolve quickly, and hybrids as well. But with respect to the infrastructure bill, and Professor Stavins went over it in general, but this is a good summary of what the key elements of it are. The infrastructure bill, of course, is not all about energy. A very significant part of it is roads, bridges, major projects. That's 109 billion right there, and we desperately need them. We cannot go on with the traffic congestion that we have at the moment. So all of these, and a lot of it is due to the age of the roads and the bridges and the other major elements of our transportation system. Safety, public transit is going to zoom up by nearly 50 billion in commitment to that. Passenger and freight rail, obviously, President Biden is a great aficionado of passenger rail. And we see also a big push towards electric vehicle infrastructure, which is going to be really built up very, very rapidly and is developing already here, but that is going to be a major, major initiative. And of course, public transit, electric buses and other transits. Also the reconnecting, there's a concept here of reconnecting communities. That's a little fuzzy unless you realize that in the US, we have had a very unpleasant habit of building major, major highways and other infrastructure right in the middle of communities. And sometimes in a thoughtless way, vis-a-vis, or perhaps not as thoughtful way of the impact that would have on minority communities, congested communities in major cities, and trying to reconnect these communities that may have been cut in half by major roads, major transit systems that have really caused a disruption in the communities, and trying to reconnect. So that's what that means in the Biden infrastructure plan. Ports and waterways, we know that we need help. The port system is overcrowded right now, obviously with the massive amounts of imports that we're having. That needs to really be addressed and addressed rapidly and effectively. It's a huge problem. Airports need refreshing, refurbishing. They also need to switch over to more renewable energy in these major infrastructure elements, such as an airport. Ports and waterways, of course, need to be refreshed and renewed. Infrastructure financing, we know that has to happen. We know we have to make huge amounts of money available for infrastructure financing. It can't just magically appear, particularly in a number of states that do not have the capability to raise those dollars on their own, states and other communities in those states. Water infrastructure, we have seen the fragility of our infrastructure, both with respect to water. Our roads, bridges, public transit, everything. The infrastructure is aging. It needs updating. It needs replacing. A lot of money is going to go into these areas. Environmental remediation, picking up and making better the sins of the past, and there are a lot of sins of the past. The power infrastructure, critical, huge dollars going to be invested in power infrastructure. We've seen incredible fragility in our system, both with respect to Texas and the bitter cold there that disrupted Texas electric power systems, which came as a big shock since it's an energy-rich state. And we saw a test of the power infrastructure and our whole infrastructure in general with respect to the severe weather that we've been confronted with lately. Not just heat, not just wind, not just rain, but the bitter cold that came as a big surprise too. It is the dramatic variations in weather that we're seeing that's getting harder and harder to deal with. And thus there's a $47 billion set aside for resilience. How do we recover? We can't suddenly wave a magic wand and replace everything in the US. We've got to be able to recover more quickly and not be so flabbergasted by bitter cold or severe weather in general. And that is something that is hard to even get your arms around as to what is it that has made us so fragile. And so much of it is aging infrastructure and not looking back from the big picture as to how the elements of this infrastructure fit together. So a large investment is going to be made in that arena. So we're seeing this infrastructure bill. It's exciting, and many aspects of it really, truly are infrastructure. There's nothing warm or fuzzy in these ideas. These ideas are desperately needed. Next slide, please. Cybersecurity, I mentioned that because it is a personal obsession for me. I would say that cybersecurity is one of those issues, as well as the CO2 issue, that keeps me up at night. This is what when you can't sleep at night, you think about those two because they're critical, not just to the US, but worldwide as to how we're going to make it through both in highly developed nations and in underdeveloped nations as to how first to get security in general with respect to all of the power facilities, but also cybersecurity as well. We've seen the incursions, cyber incursions into our systems, and I think that there's a huge, enormous push to get our arms around that and to really do a better job in trying to prevent these incursions. We had solar winds, we've had other events in the past. We had the blackout of 20 years ago, which may or may not have had a cyber element to it. But when you see 50 million people blacked out for several days and Toronto knocked out of power because of our connection between Canada and the US, that's a challenge, that's an issue. And so we realize that we really have to focus on cybersecurity as well as the physical security of our infrastructure. Electric vehicles, we know that we're going to be headed in that direction more rapidly, hybrids as well. We see it here, my family has them. And we're going to replace not just our individual vehicles, but all the school buses. They're going to be emission free, hopefully with a goal of at least 20% by 2026. We're going to be establishing clean hydrogen hubs to support the commercialization and deployment of clean hydrogen, which can be a very useful partial solution to these issues that confront us. Next slide, please. With respect to carbon capture, we are working hard on that, and there's an infrastructure bill has these key energy provisions in it. Grants to entities that procure commercial or industrial products that demonstrate GHG emission net reductions, and $3.5 billion to fund 4 direct air capture hubs in economically distressed communities with high levels of coal, oil, and natural gas resources to at least diminish the impacts of the problems associated with CCUS that need to be addressed. Nuclear, we really need to focus more on the technical funding and assistance for micro reactors, small modular and advanced nuclear reactors. Our fleet has been aging. We've been retiring plants over the last 20 years. Nuclear Regulatory Commission oversees these shutdowns of the nuclear plants. We still have a huge issue with respect to the nuclear waste, where to store it, how to store it, and so on. For now, it's in either stored on site of the plants or it's moved to a more central location across the country. We had spent a lot of time and money on the Nevada project, but that is at least in mothballs for now. Next slide, please. Our budget bill. We are going to spend a lot of money, $3.5 trillion in our budget bill, and hundreds of billions of that 3.5 trillion are going to be steered to committees that oversee these projects related to energy, infrastructure, and climate. Agriculture and forestry, these are committees in the Senate and House. Agriculture, energy and natural resources, environment and public works, homeland security, and governmental affairs and commerce. This is just the Congress. We're talking about just getting these issues through the Congress, let alone getting it then through the implementation phases among all the states, all of the different players. And I will, Professor Stavins alluded to it. What are these different players? And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. It's such a complicated system. Not only do we have the states, which have different energy policies and environmental policies subset to federal, or perhaps in a different direction, different interpretation. But then in addition, we have a variety of other players. We have electric cooperatives, which account for 20% of the power of power in the US. We also have cities, major cities, municipals that have their own power systems, that have their own policies and resources. Very complicated legal system. I've spent many decades in dealing with these issues. We have federal law, state law, city law, and then we have the court system, and then we have the legislature in each of these states in the interpretation of all these various policies that go into effect at a federal level, then as it works its way through the system, and then works its way through the judicial system. Professor Stavins nailed it when he said how complicated and lengthy that is, and there's no end in sight to that for under our system. It's going to take a huge amount of commitment and also consolidation of ideas so that we can move forward on these incredibly complex, expensive issues. Next slide, please. We look forward. I speak not on behalf of the U.S. government, certainly, but I believe that the entire sense of the U.S. is to move forward with Korea and continue our longtime economic ties back and forth, and the investment by the respective companies in advancing climate and clean energy. That is certainly going to be one of the key issues that we are working on is climate and clean energy, and we know that Korea is working in that direction as well. Enhance technical exchanges, cooperation to enhance those efforts to achieve 2030 goals and 2050 goals, including all these longer term strategies. Economy-wide decarbonization is going to happen. The question is, can we make it happen by 2030 and in a perfect world to achieve net zero emissions by 2050? Basically through working to decarbonize power sectors and facilitate the lower or extremely lower zero emissions vehicle development for government fleets and beyond. Our official international financing to support developing countries towards climate-aligned investments and in forms of public financing for unabated coal-fired power plants overseas. So all of these are going forward, and we see that as a direction that the world is heading in over time. Next slide, please. We thank you for the wonderful ongoing relationship between Korea and the US, sharing ideas, sharing creative ideas, sharing industrial development, and sharing people to try to move this enormously complicated, essential system forward. It's a system that impacts every person in our country and every person in the world, essentially. It's up to us to take the lead and to keep moving in the direction of resolution of these issues, of providing energy, of providing affordable, cleaner energy for our people and for the people of the world. So thank you so much. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm incredibly grateful to be able to represent the United States Energy Association and its members. We have 101 members, but they really are most of the major energy policymakers in the country belong, with natural gas, petroleum, nuclear, renewables across the board, many of the major corporations in America, and then also our major not-for-profit groups that are moving forward with the development and implementation of energy policy domestically and internationally. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila, for your comprehensive presentation. Looking at the situation in the United States, and then if you are aware of what President Biden committed himself during the president campaign about his plan to deal with the climate change, and then at that time, I recall the transportation and energy sector remained very important. Actually, Biden administration is moving ahead to make all these committed plans realized. Of course, it seems that there are a lot of challenges in the United States to bring all these plans into Rio. But there are technical expertise that United States is equipped with, and we firmly believe that United States will continue to take a leadership, not only at the international level, but also at the domestic level to address the climate change. One missing point that we didn't include in today's discussions is about Korea-U.S. cooperation on climate change outside United States and Korea. There are important areas that are looking at the opportunities for themselves from the U.S. and Korea. One important reason will be Southeast Asia. Korea has a new Southern policy, and the U.S. recently emphasized important Quad as a strategically important foreign policy. And then I recall that day after the U.S. Biden administration climate summit meeting in April, CIA director interviewed with the New York Times, and then the director said that the climate policy remains the important foreign policy in the United States. I understand why. We also need to look at the reasons of Africa and Latin America for various reasons. And then in the United States, there are issues about the forest fire and some other issues in agriculture and the forestry. So there are some additional aspects. Of course, we couldn't include them all, but I'm sure that we'll have another chances to talk about these other important issues as well. So having said that, I'd like to thank you very much for 3 wonderful presentations in the first session. Before I go to second panel discussions, once again, thank you very much.
네, 그러면 저희 이제 저희 패널 디스커션으로 가도록 하겠습니다.
Start our panel discussion. We have listened to the presentation by the speakers from the private sector, academia, and the U.S. government, and we listened to the good presentation from 3 speakers. Now we invited the panelists in Korea. I'd like to introduce each and every one of the participants. We have Tondoku, Director of Division from Korean Technology Center. We have Dave Kim from Governance Lead Global Green Growth Institute. We have Professor Park Gi-ryung from Korea Legislation Research Institute. We also have Professor Dr. Insung from Korea Energy Economics Institute. We have Vice President Chung Woo-Jin of Energy Business Newspaper. And finally, we also invited Younkyoo, Professor of Hanyang University. We have invited many professors and experts. as many as possible, but we could not do that because we need to limit the number of participants. I'd like to give 7 minutes to each and every panelist. And then if time allows, we will have a further discussion. So first, I will invite Tondoku, Director of Division of Climate Change Technology Cooperation from Green Technology Center. Dr. Chung, please make your remark. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for having me here and giving me an opportunity to make a presentation. 3 speakers made a presentations, and while I'm listening to their presentations, I became certain about something. That was that we have many agendas and areas where Korea and U.S. can cooperate, but given my institution's background, I'd like to focus on one agenda, that is technological cooperation. As previously mentioned, each and every country are coming up with the scenarios for implementing carbon neutrality, and there is one assumption. The assumption is to achieve the goal with the technologies which are not commercialized at this moment. So technology cooperation is becoming more and more important. Previously, technology cooperation was important, but development and innovation of technology for the carbon neutrality is important in 2 aspects. The first one is that previously the technology cooperation and the technology development focused on obtaining comparative edge among companies and competition. But now, technological cooperation and development should be done at the international and national level. And we have very tight schedule to achieve the technological innovation. At the national level, the nation need to take an initiative to make sure that the relevant parties can develop and innovate technologies. And we will review and update the scenarios for carbon neutrality continuously. The second is that in relation to the technology of carbon neutrality, many technologies are not just a common one like the mobile phone or laptop computers. It's not a simple product. It is related to the changes in the infrastructure and transformation in our society. So we have many steps, and it takes a lot of time for us to achieve the commercialization. And the commercialization is related to the re-establishment of the infrastructure. It means that it entails a lot of risk. Accordingly, we emphasize that study is very important rather than just developing technologies. It means that the technological cooperation at the international national level is very important. Joint study can reduce the time for the development of technology, and we need to share the ways to hedge the risk related to the technological innovation. Even though we distribute and increase the penetration of the electrical vehicles, the key technology is the battery. And if the battery is produced using the fossil fuel, the electrical vehicle itself is not environmental friendly, because it also generates carbon in the process of making the electric vehicle. And the batteries produced in some countries have higher carbon footprint than batteries produced in the US and EU. So many countries around the world need to focus on environmental friendliness and the technology that uses renewable energy. Not only Korea, but also other countries in the world contribute to making less carbon footprint. In particular, I like to mention that the bilateral technology cooperation is important, but multilateral collaboration is more important than the bilateral one. Of course, bilateral cooperation is important, because we need to include the developing countries. So developing countries requested technical support and assistance, and the Paris Agreement established a mechanism to support those developing countries in terms of technology assistance. As a mechanism, UNFCCC made the CTC mechanism, and also initiatives that allows the multilateral cooperation like P4G led by Korea. And many countries, including the US, support the technology, and that kind of participation engagement are necessary. I talked about the technology cooperation, and second, I'd like to mention the importance of the international level cooperation. Currently, we are focusing on the business level and the national level cooperation, but subnational cooperation is also important. Civil societies, cooperation, and cooperation among local governments are very important. To realize the carbon neutral society, the key is to make the energy system into distributed one from the central one. To be the distributed energy system, the role of the local government is very important. Many local governments are declaring the carbon neutrality, but this route has never been taken before, so they are not sure about the direction. As Professor Stavins pointed out, he mentioned the importance of cooperation at the subnational level. I agree with him, and the policy model that allows the subnational level cooperation is activated is required. And the kind of model and the success model for the subnational cooperation should be made. That's what I prepared for my remarks, and I'd like to turn over the microphone to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung. As we are having very limited discussion time, and I really thought that you would have more time for your presentations, but you're disappointed about the bilateral ties between the US and the Republic of Korea while discussing the climate issues. But still, of course, the high-level coordination is very important. But we also have to seek some of the more solutions for other developing countries to participate in. For example, the countries in the Middle East, we can also utilize them as one of the channels. Between the two countries, we can also seek another more issues by utilizing the multilateral participations joined by a lot more countries. And we are also going to focus the ways, as you mentioned, about the subnational level and issues. Thank you very much for your comments. Next, we'll be joined by governance lead of Global Green Growth Institute, David Kim. I believe that he is only the panelist who is taking the US, the passport here. Thank you very much.
GGGI is a treaty-based intergovernmental international organization, and our working language is English. But the real reason is that my Korean is very soturo, and so if you will excuse me, and I will speak in English. First of all, Professor Chung, it's an honor to be here, and I'm very pleased to be here. I would like to extend my appreciation to the Institute, to the university, to all participants, the speakers, both American and Korean. And as you just mentioned, I think I am a bit of a unique position as a Korean American, and we are talking about ROK-US cooperation here. I was very happy to see our colleagues from the US Embassy, and very happy to see the experts here from our various institutions within Korea. I am not a technical expert, as you just mentioned, Professor Chung. I lead the governance business of the Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI. And if I may, I would like to just take a step back and look at the macro view, the big picture, if you will, and briefly talk about how Korea and US can do something outside of the bilateral realm. I think we just touched upon that, including Dr. Chung. There are many U.S. ROK similarities. Our speakers, Dr. Stavins, they mentioned this and very thoroughly and in an excellent manner. But there are the developing countries within Korea and within the U.S. The U.S. It had been very difficult for the last 4 years, as we all know, with the previous administration. And as an American passport again holder with the new administration, I feel like I can hold my head up a little bit higher with less shame. And in Korea, I'm just as proud as with some of the progress that's been made. I think it was only 3-4 years ago that you could not conceive of Korean industries and business leaders, CEOs, when we have conversations. There was very strong pushback for something ambitious when it came to the NDCs. But now, in just the last few years, you could really see a shift here. And I should mention that I have 2 titles within GGGI. The other title is Special Advisor to Mr. Ban Ki-moon. Mr. Ban Ki-moon is the president of our assembly and the chair of our council. So I have the privilege of being with him in a lot of countless high-level dialogue, and it's just very encouraging within Korea how things have progressed, as well as outside. It used to be the UK and the EU and all of these developed countries were pushing Korea, and it was not welcome because it's naturally easier for us to come up with our own internal domestic policies, but to have external pressure, it can rub the wrong way, even if it might be the right thing to do. But now our citizens, our civil society, and our businesses have really changed, and I think it's very encouraging. For GGGI, as an international organization, we have 40 member states, the majority of which are developing countries. And our MO is to bring developing projects and programs to these developing countries, especially green growth, infrastructural, renewable energy, sustainable landscapes, and many more. We just talked about ASEAN a couple of minutes ago. The majority of ASEAN countries are GGGI members, and we have had a huge focus. I think we have partners like the Green Climate Fund, the USAID, KOICA, of course, and a very big amount, the majority comes from European countries for the donors. But there's that private sector, and this is my first point that I would just like to briefly highlight. There's a private sector potential. You see LG in Korea making a commitment to sustainable development and energy. I think this is huge. Just like Apple and Google and Microsoft made such commitments, Korean companies are coming on board because it's the right thing to do and it's the sensible thing to do. I think about 6-7 years ago, most of the corporations and businesses thought, well, it might be the moral thing to do, but it didn't make sense economically. Now you see renewable energy, just to take one example, being economically sensible compared to the conventional fossil fuel-based energy sources. So not only is it the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. And that's why it's natural that LG and SK and all these other companies within Korea, as well as abroad, are jumping on the bandwagon. Developing countries have a capacity issue. They do not know how to make the necessary legislation or the regulations and the policies and the strategies. And it's GGGI where we come in, we can do that. And I think that's where GGGI can be very helpful to Korea and both the US for both countries to be able to do this multilaterally, not necessarily all bilaterally, as KOICA and USAID and the State Department are already doing. Within Korea, we are already developing new partnerships with the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and other ministries and agencies aside from KOICA for us to do just that. And now we are developing more with the private sector, as I mentioned. including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and many more. The second part of what GGGI does is, besides the implementation, starting with the assessment all the way to the implementation, is just before implementation is for these developing countries who lack the capacity to be able to find green investments and funding, to be able to design and to help implement bankable projects, because corporations and governments see that this is a good investment. I think that is the key. So because these developing countries do not have carbon-based infrastructure already, where we have to take it down and replace with a new one, but it's like a blank sheet of paper where you can develop the right type of infrastructure, not the wrong type of infrastructure, not business as usual. And GGGI does this because it has two key strengths, in my opinion. One is our country offices. We have over 30 country offices throughout the world. Our country offices are embedded in the host governments. So they work side by side, shoulder to shoulder, every day to be able to devise, assess, and design such projects and policies and projects, and then of course implement, bringing in the type of green funding and investments. And the second is what I just mentioned, the value chain. From the assessments, a lot of times we get countries, potential partners that say, we want this, but our experts can be able to see the big picture, see what they need. Small island development states might be different from a landlocked African country, what their needs are. And we start with the assessment all the way to implementation. And I think if the Korea and the US and other bilateral partners can be able to leverage more multilateral funding to be able to bring in ODA and green their ODAs, not just the standard brown ODA, I think we can really make a huge impact in the developing countries that have yet to set up the wrong type of infrastructure or the wrong type of policies. I think I'll limit my comments there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. So we had a chance to
어떻게
to the bilateral cooperation between Korea and the United States on climate change, right? Okay. Now, 이제 세 번째로 박사님을 모시도록 하겠습니다.
I'd like to invite Dr. Bob from Korea Legislation Research Institute, and she's a research fellow of the Department of Future Legislation Project, and she has studied many things about the climate change policies. Hello, everyone. My name is Park Gi-ryung from Korea Legislation Research Institute. Our institute studied the Biden administration's climate change legislation and the future predictions, and that was the research topic of my institute, and I jointly studied the subject with the Younkyoo, who are here with us from Hanyang University. So I'd like to share my thoughts, and I'm very honored to listen to the good presentation by many speakers. It is a trivial topic, but I'd like to talk about the page 2 of the presentation material of Professor Robert Stavins. And he pointed out that Korea will submit its NDC. And Korea already submitted the second NDC already. The existing target was to reduce 37% based on BAU, but our second NDC submitted is to reduce the emission by 24.7% based on 2017 level. We changed the absolute goal and elevated our target in the second NDC, and we already made the revision in the legislation. As the President Kim Ki-hoon pointed out in the opening remarks, we are in the process of revising the enforcement decree regarding the revised NDC. We are studying the legislation, and we were surprised by the news that the infrastructure bill was passed in August, and it was a huge document. And the major points in the infrastructure bill was covering the railway infrastructure, railway, waterway, mall infrastructure, water infrastructure, architecture. It was very comprehensive bill, and I think that climate change, transportation, building, and even railway will be the subject of our research. I think this infrastructure bill can be the foundation, the legal foundation for us to look at these areas from the researcher's perspective. For the past 4 years, I have been involved in the research for the climate change legislation, and I felt that there was a small progress in the legislation in the United States, but this bill, if this bill will pass in the House as well, will lay the foundation for the response to climate change. And it is not limited to one government ministry's effort. With the legal foundation, I hope that it will start and initiate the all ministry level cooperation and initiatives. EU also passed the climate law, and the US, if the US passed the infrastructure bill in the House, I think that the policy for 2030 target has a firm legal foundation. And I think that in the process of international cooperation, the consensus and the cooperation can be continuous based on these kind of legal foundations. I think that this legislation is meaningful because it laid the legal foundation for us to promote our cooperation. And I'm very honored as a researcher to see the progress in the US legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Park. And briefly, let me also highlight some of the comments. Currently in the US, the infrastructure bill was also touched upon about your comments. But then also watching news yesterday, a lot of the challenges have been also shared throughout the news, along with a lot of the newspaper articles. As we also held the second Global Forum on Climate Change Law and Institutions, so regarding the CBAM, related laws and institutions and infrastructure bill in the U.S. are the key issues, not only just for the CBAM, but also for the broad context issues are still one of the key topics as one of the very key the legislative institutions and the acts. If really to have the forum on climate change and law institutions, a lot of the countries have only mainly talked about the domestic issues, but still, as we are having the more extensive the spectrum to talk about the international circumstances because of the climate change as well as the Paris Agreement, and still the countries around the world are to establish the framework, and then to do so, the Paris Agreement is one of the fundamental tools, and that's why we have to submit the NDCs. In this regard, some of the unexpected plans, not only for the domestic legally binding legislations to implement the international treaty, support such a very strong coordination to really push ahead for the international agreements based on their domestic legislations with the technologies as well. Therefore, the NDCs submitted by the different countries are to be utilized for implementing for the international agreement, and which is the Paris Agreement. Therefore, that's why we have to push ahead to really strongly implement the Paris Agreement as a very big framework. As we have also listened to the presentations from the US, and still there are a lot of issues along with the states as well as the federal issues as very complicated issues, but still a lot of the countries are also pushing their efforts to really meet and satisfy the requirements and commitments for the NDCs as well as we have assessed. So next will be joined by the research fellow of the Korea Energy Economics Institute, Professor Insung. So Professor Sung is now joining us the online platform from Ulsan, one of the remote cities from Seoul. So I'm going to give the 7 minutes. Good morning, everyone. I am Insung from the Korea Energy Economics Institute. I was listening to a lot of the football and valuable comments, and thank you very much for giving this opportunity. Regarding the climate change responses, I'm going to briefly share my comments regarding the cooperations between the US and Korea in responding to climate change. Climate change issue cannot be solved by just one country, requiring the more and more countries to participate in around the world. In this regard, the economic size and the gas emissions for the bilateral cooperation between Korea and the US could also deliver very plus, just the positive outcomes. Then how we can deal with the climate change and build the cooperation with the US. As we also listen to the director of the division of the Climate Change Technologies Cooperation, Mr. Chung, has also highlighted that we still have to think of the ideas for the strengthening the bilateral cooperation. In terms of the energy dominance, as well as the scientific leadership with the economic as well as the security issues, the energy and the scientific as well as the technology sectors, not only for the past administration, but also for the half century, the US has been actually pushing a lot of the efforts to really solve the climate change as one of the countries with pushing for more than the 2.5 folds in terms of the energy, the efforts even higher than the Japan, which was the top countries of the time. As of the 2011, 9% in nuclear generation, 14% in energy efficiencies, 8% in energy, and 3% in the energy storage, and 4% in other sectors. For many various energy sectors in the different energy sectors are now undergoing. So we have to highlight that about the more than the 2/3 of the policies are depending on the other energy policies. These are not included as the key priorities for the energy sector, but still the new and the cutting-edge technologies are to be included and applied as the other category. About 4 decades ago, the US has been continuously conducting and investing into the more than 2/3 of the energy sector as one of the top priority. And that's, we have seen a pathway for the US, which has been really taking a lot of the efforts for the climate change responses. Korea, the US, and many other countries have revised the word for the 2030 target to transform into the net zero emissions with very proactive efforts. But why not we have not come up with a 5 or 10 year? Why we really have to submit the 2030 net zero emissions? Because based on the current level of the technologies, the 2030 target
or net zero emissions cannot be achieved only by the existing level of the technologies. For the 2050 target, still the current level of the technologies which are developing are to be guaranteed as well. Therefore, for such efficient the global responses against the climate change, still the technologies in the low developed countries are to be more applied as well. For the US and one of the leading countries in terms of the manufacturing Korea, not only for the two countries, but also for the global cooperation, also joined by the other developing countries as well, are to participate and to be more encouraged for the climate change responses. Another way for cooperation is that as of this year, the EU, in order to revise the upward 2030 target, has announced about the policy packages. For the CBAM, the greenhouse gas emissions have also touched upon for other countries which have not really fully participating in the target. To do so, within the countries in the EU, with other countries could be participated in the fair market mechanisms. But Biden, the president of the US, as one of the campaign agendas and commitments, have also suggested and proposed one of the ways for the climate change responses, as well as the quota allocation. And then, the trade representative of the US, as of the March this year, in order to implement the climate change issues, they have also announced to consider to impose the CBAM tariff as well. As one of the key countries, the Korea, once we also introduce some of the new and the related law, but we'll also have the very positive outcomes as well, as we have the more imports from the US. But still, to deal with the climate change and to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, still we are seeing expanding the spectrum in terms of the cooperation between the two countries. 3% and 10% revenues increase, and we are looking forward to see the percentage in terms of the efficiencies. In this regard, the introduction of the CBAM by the US could also lead to the ripple effects to the stakeholders in the Korean market as well. In advance, we also have to put more the cooperations between the two countries in advance, along with the prior dialogues to fully implement those CBAM issues. Lastly, to deal with the climate change, the limited countries cannot really fully implement the climate change issues. We need more and more countries to participate in the responses against the climate change. Therefore, for many countries to establish and make the ways for implementing or the calling for the actions are one of the key agendas that we have to discuss. In accordance with the Paris Agreement, still, we are also ongoing for the dialogues and issues to help to implement the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, during the Trump administration, the U.S. withdrew the membership from the Paris Agreement. So when it comes to implementations and also actions, the U.S. seemed very challenging to really participate in the Paris Agreement, of course. But as the Biden took office as the new president of this year, and again, the U.S. would join the Paris Agreement, that we can see a new possibility for the more international cooperation to build and to respond to the climate change. Therefore, for the climate change issues on the international stage, are to be more utilized for strengthening the cooperation between the two countries. And that's the end of my comments.
감사합니다. 손 박사님께서는 오늘 이제 에너지 경제 연구원에 계시니까 또 오늘 저기 미국에서 발제하신 분들이 이제 에너지 쪽으로 발제가 많이 되셨고요. 또 사실 에너지가 굉장히 중요한 부문임이 틀림이 없으니까 그런 측면에서 특히 이제 에너지 기술과 관련해 가지고 기존의 전통적인 관심을 가지고 있는 기술들도 있지만 새로운 신기술 거기가 아마 지금은 기타로 분류되어 있는 게 나중에는 메인으로 되겠죠. 그런 것들이 숨어 있는 것도 사실 우리나라가 이제는 대등하게 협력할 수 있는 기술력을 가지고 있습니다. 그래서 그런 측면에서 이 GTC만 오늘 참여하신 GTC만 하더라도 어쨌든 조직상으로는 우리나라의 대표적인 기술 연구 기관은 키스트 산하로 계시기 때문에 그래서 우리나라의 그런 역량들이 어떻게 보면 이제는 굉장히 머추어져 가고 있다고 그렇게 볼 수도 있는데 그런 측면에도 협력을 많이 해야 된다라는 걸 강조해 주신 건 굉장히 좋은 포인트 같습니다. 그리고 미국에서 일반적으로 기후 변화를 대응하기 위해서 필요한 어떤 조치들을 들여오게 되고 특히 우리나라에서 요즘에 관심을 가지고 있는 미 EU의 C방과 비슷한 어떤 미국의 탄소 국경 조정 제도가 들어오는 경우에 이것이 뜻하지 않게 한미 간의 기후 변화 협력에 장애물이 되지 않도록 하는 것이 중요할 것 같다. 그런 측면에서는 오늘 미국 대사관에서도 참여를 해주셨지만 다양한 미국의 이해관계자와 처음부터 이러한 점에 대해서 언더스탠딩을 서로 간에 높여가고 상호 간에 협력하는 방안을 처음부터 우리들이 추진을 하는 것이 굉장히 필요한 것 같기도 합니다. 그래서 그런 측면에서 손 박사님께서 굉장히 좋은 코멘트를 해주셨습니다. 다음으로 저희 그 패널리스트로서 그 언론계에서 저희 후원 기관이기도 하신 에너지 경제신문의 부사장으로 계시는 정우진 부사장님을 모셨습니다. 이렇게 굉장히 많은 경험들을 에너지 분야에 사실은 저희보다 폭은 훨씬 넓으실 것 같은데 정우진 부사장님께서 7분 동안 토론해 주시겠습니다. 부사장님 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 에너지 경제신문의 정우진 부사장입니다. 오늘 저는 바이든 정부의 탄소 중립 정책을 에너지를 중심으로 해서 고려될 사항에 대해서 말씀드리겠습니다. 이미 앞서 이제 말씀해 주신 그 패널 분들께서 협력 부분을 말씀하셨기 때문에 저는 그 부분에 대해서 4가지 부분만 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다. 첫째는 이제 조 바이든 대통령은 이제 평소에 기후 변화를 이제 기후 위기라고 주장을 하셨습니다. 그럼으로써 이제 미국에서는 막대한 탄소 중립을 위해서 투자가 됐는데요. 투자를 지금 예상하고 있는데요. 주로 입법 제도보다는 행정명령을 선택했다는데 저는 리스크가 있다고 생각합니다. 지난 1937년부터 2013년까지 77년 동안 한 6천여 개의 대통령의 행정명령이 있었습니다. 그 중에서 한 50%가 넘는 안건이 수정이 되었거나 후임자에 의해서 철회됐다는 겁니다. 현재 미국의 상하원은 민주당이 우세에 있지만 탄소 중립이 연방정부 예산의 결정에 막대한 영향력이 있기 때문에 이러한 리스크에 대해서는 특별히 관심을 가져야 된다고 생각합니다. 둘째 부분은 미 행정부는 글로벌 기후 리더십을 갖고자 합니다. 또한 미국 내 강력한 통상 정책을 희망하고도 있습니다. 또 이런 부분에 있어서 리스크가 또 존재하고 있습니다. 바이든 행정부는 지난 4월에 기후 정상회의를 개최하였습니다. 트럼프 이후에 유명무실한 회의가 다시 개최됐다고들 합니다. 앞으로 개최되는 국제 정상회의에서 기후 정상회의에서 글로벌 기후 변화의 리더십을 역할을 하고자 했던 취지라고 생각합니다. 오늘 9월 24일에는 쿼트 정상회담이 워싱턴에서 열립니다. 또 10월에는 G20 정상회의가 있고요. 또 COP26이 동시에 개최됩니다. 제가 예상하기로는 쿼트와 G20 정상회의에서는 기후변화를 비롯한 코로나 백신, 첨단 기술 협력이 주로 논의될 걸로 생각이 됩니다. 이와 관련해서 9월 10일 중국 시진핑은 미국과 중국 간의 기후변화 협력은 올바른 궤도 위에 올려야 된다고 말했습니다. 미국 기후변화 정책에 대해서 강력한 불쾌감을 드러냈다고 생각합니다. 최근 중국 왕 외교부장은
Disagreement with the U.S.'s behavior. Climate change policies of the China may be talked about. The carbon neutrality implementation policy is likely to face the opposition from China. And at the international society, China also wants to take the initiative in the climate and issues. And China wants to invest a lot of money in the developing countries. The largest carbon emitter and the US will compete against each other to take the leadership position in this area. Greenhouse gas emissions should be cut, and it should be there should be a good performance for the U.S. to take a leadership role in the global society community. The third one is that, as you know, the U.S. depends on import than production. So the carbon production is about 22% from the industry, and the carbon emission is based on fair transition law. And the U.S. said that it will adopt the carbon border tax by 2024. And US and the EU may be cooperated, but the competition and the conflicts of interest are expected at the international level, and that will be the biggest obstacle for the Biden administration. And the fourth one is that the U.S. has weak electrification and the demand for the electric vehicle. The demand for the electric vehicle is just 3%, and the goal is a goal to achieve a 50% or more electric vehicle, and making the infrastructure may be the ambitious goal. And the battery share, production share, is not that good enough. It was just 35%. And the U.S. companies' share in the battery production is a mere 14%. Even Korean companies are a strong powerhouse in terms of battery production. There is no outstanding U.S. company in the battery production. So that's why the U.S. company and the Korean company need to cooperate. And the Tesla and other automakers stick to the combustion engine. And recently, the automakers were gathered together and the president focused on the production of the environmental-friendly vehicles. And we think that the coal-powered power plant will disappear. But the urgent thing to do is to address the outdated power grid. U.S. is prone to natural disasters, and the hurricane hit the U.S. that flooded the subway stations and that led to the blackout situation. It means that the U.S. is vulnerable to natural disasters. Energy networks stability and recovery is important, and this should be the priority in the climate change policy. And in that regard, I think U.S. needs to cooperate with Korea. That's all from my side.
Thank you very much. We also talked about many different issues between the U.S. and Korea, why we have to have the cooperation, considering the other third countries as well. In this regard, between the Korea and the U.S., the existing cooperation was mainly based on the security. But nowadays, we are seeing that the non-traditional security representing the climate change could be also the key issues. In this regard, to strengthen the higher level of the cooperation, job creation, and the economic growth, so that the level of the welfare could be also increased. and the just transitions and just the procedures could be also pursued as well, so that we can also get more prepared for strengthen the bilateral cooperation. Of course, we have known a lot of the factors for the highlighting the cooperation, but still we also have to discover more ideas in order to respond to the climate change. In this regard, so it was very nice comment that we were able to know about the ideas. And last panelist will be the Professor Kim Younkyoo, Professor of the Division of International Studies of Hanyang University. So please proceed with your comments and only in 7 minutes. Thank you. I am Professor Kim Younkyoo of Hanyang University. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity as a panelist. Today, I'm going to talk about the issues regarding the recent climate policies in the U.S., which is the Biden administration's, the EV, the executive order as of the March this year, the more than 50% to be transformed into the EVs as a part of the executive orders. If you look at the May in this year, the Biden listed one of the manufacturing plant in the Ford, and he also announced it in a very similar ways in May this year. Why is he highlighting the EV market? Because in the US, they have actually developed a lot of the progresses into the EV market, and that's a low cost, the infrastructure, the energy consumption, especially the EV, when it comes to the public transit and transit systems are the key issues. Now, I'm just wondering that when it comes to reducing the GHG, the greenhouse gas emissions, and facilitating the EVs, whether the US will also strengthen the metal issues as well. The metal, the 99% of the metals are also from the earth, the ground, but only the 1% is the rare earth materials. There's such a very limited amount of the 1%, the rare earth materials are utilized for the vehicles and the cars. But still, in this regard, still they are very lack of the amount of the rare earth materials or the metal. In the 20th century, the petroleum was a leading factor, but the 21st century will be led by the rare earth metal. Probably the country which can dominate the rare earth metal could be the key country in the future. The rare earth metal as well as the supply changes for the processings are definitely essential. Processing value chain, supply chain, and also all the facilities and systems for making the components are currently dominated by China. And I have also conducted some of the researches on that. According to my research, I have actually been reviewing the very long time phenomena for about the last 2 decades. So a lot of the wealth are still being transformed from the US into China. The wealth that have been transformed from the US into China amounted about $4 trillion, which is about the size of the GDP in Germany. And regarding infrastructure bill, the $6 trillion as a national budget and $8 trillion would be the one of the prospected one. And the $1 trillion is to be applied for the infrastructure bill. And 1/3 of that is to be applied for the EV. Then $4 trillion, actually the amount of the wealth have been transferred from the US into China. Then how come such amount of the wealth were able to move from the US into the China? I was really conducting the research about the causes and the channels, about the wealth transferred into China for a long time. And the result was about one of the report for the supply chain. If you look at that research paper, then probably how the U.S. be taking the solutions and ideas when it comes to dealing with such a transfer that wealth from the U.S. into China. In this regard, for the interactions between the Korea and the U.S. cooperation are to be more directive and the more the discovered in a thoroughly manner. We also have to focus on some of the discussions as well and dialogues as well between the two countries. The issues regarding the EVs as well as the rare earth metals to be more concerned from the U.S. For the rare earth metals, and still are to be more focused in the future. The second point I'm going to share with you is that related to these issues, too, we are seeing a lot of the huge boom for the mining industries, not only just for the traditional metal, but actually in order to discover and extract the rare metals, the mining industries are jumping into the market to really extract a lot of the amount of the rare metals in the future. In the country and some of the Southeast Asia, as well as Latin America, and then China. When it comes to developing in the mining industries, such a the huge boom for extracting rare metals, not only for petroleum, but also for the greenhouse gas emissions reduction are to be, and actually these are the concerning for the greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And now it's time to really develop such mechanisms by utilizing the technologies in the mining industries, but it takes a lot of the cost to do so for renewable energy or EV, but when it comes to the transitions into the carbon reduction. And so such amount of the development, especially for the lithium as well, the decarbonized sources are the one of the key components and key materials for EVs. So such a new environmental challenges are to be thoroughly discussed and concerned for the future. And lastly, about 2 months later, and I am going to soon the public one of my research paper entitled "The Rare Metals Would Transform the Global Economy." So you can also refer to the result of my research paper as well soon in the future. John Kerry also addressed to the media and the corner of the market and such very limited countries around the world seize the market of the rare metals in the future. So between the U.S. and China, and we can also look at some of the conflicts or the relations between the countries in the future. That's all.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Can cooperate the EV sector between the Korea and the U.S., but there could be more issues that is behind the cooperation that was not thought and talked about before, and thank you very much for pointing out that point. He pointed out the mining and the countries like Botswana, which produces diamonds a lot. African countries can be considered as LDC country, but Botswana is not the kind of country because Botswana has the mining sector, which produces the largest amount of carbon emissions. The Botswana need to produce diamonds, and they uses a lot of power from fossil fuel sources. That's why we need to think about the developing countries, and we need to involve the developing countries like Botswana, and we need to also talk about the transition as a future discussion topic. And South Africa also is the electricity area, and some countries need to be considered when we talk about the EV. And the rare matter issues are much talked about in the resource sector, and some people looked at this as an opportunity, and we need to think about this kind of rare metal issue. Is it a climate issue really? Can be the part of the climate change issue, and that's why the Vice President Chung pointed out in that regard. And have heard of the circular economy, and the kind of topic need to be considered in our agenda. We are focusing on energy, but some presenters talked about agriculture and nature-based solutions and the forestry. This is grabbing the attention, and many countries will have more interest in this area in terms of the biodiversity. I think that the cooperation between the Korea and the United States for climate change have to cover the traditional issues as well as newly emerging issues. Thank you for making good points. And then we have listened to the opinion of the panelists. The U.S. government sector, academia, and the private sector presenters made a presentation, and the U.S. NDC does not have the fast train because there are many reasons for that. The highway train and the railway from the east to the west could require a lot of investment. It could be a larger scale than the New Deal project. 2007 or 2008, when the Copenhagen climate change discussion was coming, there were many ideas presented, and there were many ideas shared to go to the low carbon economy. And as far as I remember, it was 2008. And in the upcoming G20 meeting, many stakeholders talked about the low carbon economy, and then the Lehman Brothers event occurred that led to the global financial crisis, and many people at the time were worried about the idea because there was a significant problem in the financial sector. But at that time, I think many people talked about the Green New Deal concept, and many international organizations focused on the green infrastructure, and one of the organizations was World Bank. And we are accustomed to the green policy. We have had many policies, but we have been like a hold due to the outbreak of the COVID-19. And the infrastructure in the U.S. may have some compromising point between the Democrats and the Republicans, depending on the definition. It could be a green area or it could not be a green area. But with that bill, the greenhouse gas emissions will surely be reduced. As Professor Kim Younkyoo pointed out, many issues, we, Korea, need to look at this issue from a different perspective. We have some more time to finish our discussion here. So I made some comments to each panelist talk. So finally, I will give 1 minute to each panelist to make up closing comments. That's the final procedure for our forum today. I'd like to invite Tondoku first.
As mentioned before, along with the technological cooperation and the sharing and the political issues, and I'd like to also highlight that regarding the human resources, we also have to exchange the human resources, especially for the 2030 and 2050 targets between Korea and the US as for the next generation in the future. Such exchanging the human resources are very essential to understand the cultural differences as well as to share and concern the ways for the climate change issues. I strongly believe that exchanging human resources are definitely needed. Thank you very much for your comments. Dave?
Seconds, I think. I think we mentioned earlier the COVID pandemic. It really was a setback for the whole entire global community. But we at GGI, more than a year ago, starting quite early after the World Health Organization declared the pandemic from the coronavirus, we immediately, I think one thing we did really well was we decided, well, this is not only a challenge, but it's an opportunity. And what we did was we came up with many ideas to green the COVID recovery. Trillions and trillions of dollars have been rounded up for economic recovery. And the whole idea was to not just build back as usual, but build back better. And we've already been successful in helping approximately 20 of our member countries to tailor their COVID recovery into a green recovery. And I think if we look hard enough, there will always be such opportunities within the challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 다음에
Next, Professor Park-Kyung. Let me briefly share my comments regarding the climate change, the responses, as well as the policies for the carbon neutrality, cooperation, development, and exchange of the human resources, and the technological cooperation have been also discussed throughout today's forum. On behalf of the KLRI, for such a cooperation, development, as well as the discussions are to be more strengthened so that we can really continue to research on those issues and the areas. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you make a comment, Professor Sun? Response to climate change is a serious issue, and we all know and understand the necessity of the response to climate change. I think that's the common sense these days. But what is lacking is that the climate change response requires a lot of money, and we need to invest some money and fund. But I think the awareness of the necessity of the fund is not good enough. So we need to cooperate in this direction to improve the awareness.
Thank you. Next, Vice President Chung Woo-Jin. In the future between Korea and the US for the climate change cooperation, as all the other panelists have highlighted, for such the very high and advanced cooperation for the climate change issues between the US and Korea are definitely fundamental for EVs, semiconductors, batteries. For the $44 trillion have been also committed for such developing the cooperations in the very cutting-edge technology sectors. One more point I want to also share with you today is that, and still we are seeing a lot of the dependence on, like, dominated by the government to really tackle the climate change issues. Most of all, the U.S. Biden administration should also consider the economical as well as the issues in the U.S. for the China and the Korea as embracing strategies.
In 1968, Charles Park, a professor of Stanford University, who was an economic geologist, wrote a book. And in his book, its title was Jeopardy. It was not grabbing the attention much. It was the jeopardy in and he pointed out that there was a lot of resources like oil in the Middle East. And if the circumstances change, the European and the U.S. economy will face serious challenge. That was the warning that was mentioned in his book. And the reason why I point out this book is that the phenomenon is emerging these days. We experience this with the oil, and the U.S. is independent regarding oil, but the U.S. is facing the challenges in another resources. What is the implications for the Korean economy? Korean situation is more complicated. Under the U.S. umbrella, Korea was supplied sufficiently the oil and gas, but the problem of rare metal emerged. And the Korea need to solve this problem. I think that the share of the rare metal will increase and the petroleum and gas share will decrease. But petroleum supply security will face serious challenge in the future, I think. The U.S. is not involved in the oil and gas supply. The withdrawal from the Afghanistan is a good example. The reason the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan is one of the reasons is oil. So the Korea need to secure the energy security as well as the supply security. That's what I want to talk about and point out in this forum. And lithium and other rare metals can be imported by Korea, but Korea need to think about this in this way. Lithium should be placed next to the battery processing plant. That is called the battery internalization. But how long can Korea be dependent on the imported lithium? Like the gold rush in California in 1850, that kind of situation is occurring nowadays. The phenomenon and situation 150 years ago is repeated nowadays. So we need to look back on the history and we need to set the direction for the Korean government properly. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Sheila Hollis for your closing remarks.
I would be happy to. This is my observation. 30% of the world has no energy whatsoever. Not dirty energy, not inadequate energy, just no energy whatsoever. Beyond our own shores and beyond our own interests, we need very much to make the world better, and by leading by example and doing that, hopefully that will reduce CO2 emissions worldwide to at least begin more steps. And everything is a baby step because of dollars and other restrictions. But all that being said, beyond our own shores, a world is in need and awaits, and we have the technology, we have the intellectual firepower, and we have the financial resources over time to help do that. So certainly, I think the vision for both of our developed and thoughtful countries is to try to make the world better, which will redound to our benefit as well in many, many ways. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you tonight. It's been a tremendous privilege, or I should say this morning for you, been a tremendous privilege, and I've learned a lot, and I look forward to seeing the translations from Korean of all the obviously outstanding presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. 이렇게 해서 저희들이 한미 기후변화
Thank you very much. So we also discuss about issues that how we could really deal with the climate change as the one of the very fundamental issues for the international community. We talked about the climate change cooperation between Korea and the US and between Korea and the EU. It means that it requires a lot of cooperation. But sometimes our discussion is moving toward the non-cooperation. The reason why I mentioned this is that domestically, a reduction at the domestic level is very important. We need to put all the resources to achieve that. But the Article 6 Paris Agreement is the only article that promotes the international cooperation. We only hear and understand it as the carbon emission right, but when you read carefully the Paris Agreement, all the talks that was presented today can be incorporated into the Korean-US cooperation agreement, and that will strengthen the cooperation between the two parties. And if the both parties agree, we could also exchange with the advanced countries, and we also exchange it with developing countries. It will not be mandatory, but based on the good understanding among interested parties, we will have more opportunities. The U.S. is the traditional ally, and we need to explore more opportunities and horizon in our fight against climate change. Thank you for your participation, and that's the end of this forum. Thank you very much.